Okay, I'm going to get us started here. This is Hannah Kramer with Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. Thank you so much for joining us to the Technical Research Team meeting for EMIS. We're going to be talking today about the value of distributed energy resources to owners, a current market landscape. This is something that we've been looking at over the past 3 or 4 months or so, and we're going to be reporting out on our findings in this kind of a market overview of where things are at with installing DERs on owner sites. So here we go. Advance the slide. All right, Claire, are you on the line now? No, okay, we're having some audio problems. So I'm going to give an overview of some of the quickly slides before the presentation. Better Buildings is having a virtual leadership symposium instead of the Better Buildings Summit. You know, unfortunately, that had to be canceled. But this summit is, or the symposium is going to allow you to hear a lot of the same webinars and peer exchanges at your leisure. So the full schedule is here. You'll get these slides. And this is all free, so you can just register and attend the things that are interesting to you. The next announcement is that we have an upcoming awards webinar. This is our last webinar for the spring awards from the Smart Energy Analytics campaign. The campaign is wrapping up, and now we're moving forward with this Better Buildings Tech Team, this being the first webinar related to the tech team. So we're wrapping up the Smart Energy Analytics campaign with these awards. We have 4 awards in the following categories, and we'll be hearing from all the award winners about, you know, their best practices and how they do things in implementing their EMIS. It's really great to hear directly from the owners and the energy managers that are working with these systems and sharing their tips and tricks. So May 20th, be sure to sign up for that through Zoom. And then another webinar coming up in later June is like the second in a series of this webinars on DERs. So this is where we're going to hear from 1 or 2 owners and operators who are members of the Better Buildings Alliance to describe how they're using DERs in their building operations. So the particular solar storage combination or storage only, we're going to have owners talk about what it's really like, how they decided to do it, and what kind of cost benefit they're getting out of it. So that's June 23rd. And like I mentioned, the Smart Energy Analytics campaign will end this summer. We're going to be doing the final report and pulling all the research together over the past almost 4 years of operation of the campaign. It's been a great campaign. We've had 104 participants and over 530 million square feet. So keep your eye out for webinars coming on all the results of that campaign. So the next steps are through the Better Buildings EMIS technical team, of which you all got this webinar through that tech team email list. We're going to be doing quarterly webinars. We're going to be talking about things like machine learning and artificial intelligence, and what does that mean for you as building management and building operators and energy managers, Internet of Things, all these buzzwords that we're going to try to demystify a little bit. And then also we'll be continuing to share resources and what's going on with your peers, you know, peer networking, that kind of thing through this tech team. So please feel free to reach out to us for what other topics you want to see covered in the tech team. Like I said, we're kicking it off with distributed energy resources, but there's lots of things related to EMIS that we could be covering in these webinars. So please contact Claire Curtin and let her know what other topics you'd be interested in seeing, or if you know other folks that are interested in being a part of the tech team, have them email her and she can get you set up. All right, so the value of distributed energy resources. We're going to be talking today about the motivations for owners to install DERs on their site and what their options are, and some guidance around system installation. So we'll show a characterization of vendors based on this research I mentioned that we've done over the last few months, and to clarify this market landscape of, who are the DER solution providers out there. With the addition of DERs like solar, there's been significant changes to utilities load profile. You've probably heard about this, including things like the duck curve, which we'll show some examples of in a bit. So with this greater amount of renewable energy on the grid, there's impacts to the grid. So it's interesting to note that DERs can be a part of the problem of this, managing a different kind of distributed grid, but also part of the solution. So we're going to be talking about how DERs and how storage can help manage that variable resource. I will give this caveat that as the EMIS research team, we're coming onto the subject of DERs from the building operations perspective. So how can these technologies fit into how you operate buildings? I'm not an expert on DER, but what we've done is pulled together information from, let's see, about 15 interviews with DER solutions providers and 5 interviews with various owners in better buildings that have installed DERs. And we've kind of pulled together this perspective on how DERs can be used to support your building operations and how those DERs can be coordinated for optimum control rather than in separate silos. So you can think about, adding DERs and adding a different control system every time you add a piece of equipment can start to get pretty cumbersome. So the goal of the webinar is to explore how DERs can be used by building owners. And in the second part of the series, like I said, we're going to be hearing from building owners about how it's gone for them, what kind of integration they've done, and what's been the challenges. As a reminder, please send your questions in through the chat feature, and Claire in the background is going to be organizing those questions, and we'll kind of bring them up periodically or at the end if it makes the most sense. All right. So this graphic on the right shows the various DERs we're talking about here when we say distributed energy resources. We're talking about solar photovoltaics, we're talking about battery storage, thermal storage, combined heat and power, and then things that you may not think about as DERs are also considered DERs because they can help you manage your loads. So flexible building loads, the ability to shed and shift HVAC and lighting loads is considered a DER, and the controls necessary to be able to do that in a seamless way. Electric vehicle charging is also considered a DER because there's ways to control that so it doesn't hit your peak load. We're going to talk more about electric vehicles in a bit. So one common theme for installing DERs is the need for this integrated controls, and here we call this DER optimization. This is the software that pulls all these DERs together and has a logic to operate the various DER resources at the appropriate times. So in this graphic, we also have an overlay of what we call the EMIS, so this integration layer that includes the optimization controls perhaps, but it's the visualization, the analytics, the fault detection that you may be used to through your typical EMIS for your HVAC system now can be thought of to encompass all of your systems, including your DERs. So this is kind of a future vision. I'll say that the industry is currently in more of a siloed control phase where each of these DERs may have a separate control system. So your EV charging may be controlled separately from your building HVAC loads with your building automation system, from your battery storage with a separate control system. The vision for the future is to have these all coordinated and optimized together. And there are examples of that we'll talk about in this presentation. When we talk about these DERs, there's 2 different kinds of DERs really in terms of configuration. There's grid-tied. All these DERs are grid-tied, meaning that it'll use power from the electric grid when necessary to meet the load and can export export to the grid when generation exceeds load. And so the other configuration are microgrids, and we'll talk about those in a bit, where they can island from the grid. The key benefit then of installing these DERs is that you can actively manage your demand now. So you can reduce your utility costs, and then there's also environmental benefits and resiliency benefits, both resiliency of the buildings you're managing and the ability to keep critical loads going, and also resiliency benefits beyond that to the community if you have larger scale microgrids. So this vision kind of comes together with the Department of Energy has coined this phrase, grid interactive efficient buildings. If you've seen GEB, many of you on this call are part of the GEB working group. So I wanted to connect what we're talking about here to the term grid interactive efficient buildings. So these buildings will have, reduce utility costs, support electric grid reliability, and help balance the supply of renewable generation. And GEBs do this in 4 different ways. So I'm going to just kind of explain these examples here. You're aware of efficiency, minimizing loads, HVAC lighting, plug loads, process loads. Efficiency is where we're currently, a lot of our focus lies. Load shed, meaning you reduce loads, and actually you don't kind of have those loads in the off hours again. So let's say you're dimming your lighting. It doesn't mean you're using more lighting at night. It's just shedding it from that peak time. Load shift means you're, let's say, pre-cooling your building to limit cooling during peak times, or using stored energy to reduce the peak. So you are using that, shifting that load to off-peak times. And then finally, modulation is not yet common for building loads and building DERs, but the future of DERs will provide things like ancillary services when called upon by the grid to help balance the grid, ancillary services such as frequency regulation and operating reserves to maintain grid health. We're not going to go into all that, the details on the modulation and the ancillary services, but it's this evolving field that eventually DERs are going to be able to tap into in terms of a revenue stream from utilities. So we've worked with efficiency improvements for a long time. As I said, efficiency is really essential. We're not skipping over that efficiency step. So it's important to reduce those loads before you start shedding and shifting. All right, so what's the motivation? Why are owners interested in implementing DERs? We'll talk about each one of these DER investments as we go through this presentation. This slide here is to provide a high-level summary, so I'm not going to go through this very wordy slide, but we're going to start off with solar PV. You all know about solar. This graph on the left side shows the significant additional capacity added each year. So the bars show additional capacity. They're not showing a decrease in capacity. This is like the incremental increase in capacity each year. And then the yellow line shows how costs per watt have decreased really drastically over the early 2010s. So the impacts of this increased PV on the grid, you've probably heard of the duck curve. This is this conceptual look of a duck and how in California and many other places, it was predicted in 2013 and it actually happened. So this is a curve that shows 2013. There's some PV on the grid. As that midday solar takes load off the grid, you have reduced power demands during that time, and then it keeps going down. So the problem with the duck curve to the grid is that there's these steep ramps. When the sun sets, people come home and use energy, and then it peaks up again. So we have a new system peak, no matter, it used to be more in the late afternoon, now it's in the evening time period. And it's difficult for the grid to manage this without a fleet of generation resources that are really flexible to be able to ramp up and down quickly. You should note here that this is not on the y-axis here. It's not a net load of 0. This is 14,000 megawatts. This is not going down to 0 demand. This is going down enough where it's hard to manage from a grid perspective. But storage can help mitigate some of this impact. Charge your solar charge your storage when solar is prevalent. All right, so solar, we're going to move on here in the interest of time. We're going to move to storage. There's two types of storage. The storage that gets a lot of press is the battery storage these days. It's newer, but it's becoming a lot more prevalent, which we'll show in a graph in a second. On the right here, we have Kenny Seaton at CSU Dominguez Hills. They installed a pretty large storage to manage their peak demand and are reaping the benefits of that. And we'll talk about how that happens in a bit. Thermal storage is sort of the behind the scenes, been around a long time technology, and is starting to be, sort of remembered again. Like, we need to use thermal storage to manage our peak cooling loads. So this is an example of ice storage, and they're starting to have kind of more packaged on a pad kind of ice storage system, so it's not so custom all the time. So this is one example in that picture of that. All right. I'm trying to, oh gosh, why did I do that? I guess that it clicked the link. Sorry about that, hold on. All right, here we go. So increasing in battery storage, this is just a graph showing the projected increase, and the expected drivers for this increase are, the cost reductions, of course, and the cost of the batteries is going down a lot as more production is in place. This desire for resilience. If we don't have a stable grid, if we have wildfire implications, all of those kinds of things are driving up the need to focus on battery storage, and then also projected increases in demand charges and desire to reduce that cost, that utility cost. Combined heat and power, also known as cogeneration. This slide is just conceptual to make sure we understand why we should care about combined heat and power. Basically, a coal-fired or natural gas turbine power plant has about 30 to 40% efficiency without using that waste heat. So you have a power plant out in a remote area, you're getting about 30 to 40% efficiency. Boilers, you're getting about 80% efficiency. And so when you put it all together, you get about 45 to 55% efficiency with a traditional system. And here we have CHP. It's producing electricity and using that useful heat from a single fuel source, getting 75 to 85, potentially % efficiency. Here's an example of what current, a common system configuration in CHP with a gas turbine heat recovery unit to capture heat from the turbine's exhaust stream. So you see here that you have these this output of electricity to use in the building, but you also have the output of exhaust gas with heat recovery to serve your heating and hot water loads in your building. So this is where that efficiency comes into play. CHP is most often used for base load, so they aren't generally used to ramp up and down real quickly to meet near-term demand management, but can be very effective for minimizing costs, especially if you have a campus of buildings that can use that waste heat. Electric vehicles. I'm not going to cover this too in depth in the interest of time. I just want to mention that behind the meter electric vehicle charging can increase peak demand charges if the charging station contributes to setting that new peak. So this thing called smart EV charging is becoming more common, where you're monitoring and managing peak demand of a fleet of EV charging stations. There's differing opinions whether You should delay charging to avoid setting a system peak. If people who are charging their EV want to charge now and not later. But if the costs continue to increase for peak demand, it's going to be more economical to delay some charging to that time when solar is really prevalent and you can have a low cost of energy at that point instead of setting a peak demand with your EVs. All right, so we mentioned microgrids earlier. One thing that is a common misperception in the industry is that because you have PV and batteries that you can use them when the grid goes down. That's, you know, we talked with the vendors that said, that's what people think, you know, and it's actually not true. If they're just grid connected, you can't operate the system if the grid's down. It relies on the grid to set that signal wave. You have to have a switch. So here it's shown as a very on-off kind of disconnect switch with the grid so that you can microgrid in a safe fashion for utilities. So most DER systems can't operate during a grid outage because they're not configured as microgrids, although microgrids are really growing and advancing in recent years. So from a resiliency standpoint, obviously we're wanting to maximize the uptime of the facilities and avoid production and productivity losses from not having power. All right, so the other piece to this puzzle of you have DERs, you have either it's a microgrid or grid tied, you have optimization controls. So if you think about all the things that need to be considered when you're deciding whether to charge or discharge your battery storage or your thermal storage or enable your on-site generation like CHP, although that may be baseload in any case, flex your building loads or flex your EV charging. These are the things that these are the levers we have to change our, in accordance to minimizing costs. So the inputs that are required to think about and are inputs to the software, the DER optimization software, are your detailed utility rate schedule, including your peak demand and your energy costs and your time of use costs, your solar production forecast. And this isn't just at this time of year, we tend to get this amount of solar. It's like hourly based on your microclimate kind of solar power forecast. It gets very detailed. Your financial value of backup power. So how important is it to have reserve power in your battery to serve loads? You know, what's the financial impact it would have on your business if you didn't have power? Battery thermal storage state of charge. So at any moment, the optimization routine obviously needs to know what's the state of charge of your battery or your thermal storage. Building load forecast is also a very important input to plan for how much peak demand reduction you're going to need. So you have to have a way to project what your building load is based on past performance, based on an understanding of, you know, if there's going to be events in the future that you need to plan for, like a big conference or something that might set a new peak. On-site generation that can be scheduled, like your CHP, which also can rely on fuel cells as the source, generation source. And then your grid signals and market rules. So all the rules around grid operators giving a signal when they need more generation. If you're subscribed to certain grid programs, then there's rules around how you participate in those grid programs. So pulling all these factors together, these are all inputs into the optimization control routine, and the outputs are how to dispatch these DERs. So when we're talking about DER optimization software, this is sort of the piece we're talking about, and there's a number of vendors that have software in this that do this function. All right, so the value streams. We've touched upon these a little bit. The ideal environment for DER economics is high peak demand charges and DER is providing multiple value streams. So we tried to organize these into kind of the high-level value streams of energy bill savings, resiliency, additional revenue opportunities beyond your energy bill savings, and then carbon reduction. The order of your value, which some people call your value stack, depends on your rates and your revenue opportunities, like which utility programs you have in your area, and so forth. So in general, this first value stream of reducing your peak demand charges is the thing that saves a lot of costs for owners, at least at this point. If they can reduce their monthly peak demand charges using their stored energy or reducing their building loads with flexible building loads and responding by shedding or shifting demand, then they can save money on their demand charges, and then they can also use that stored energy during high energy price times. So that's called energy arbitrage. You know, you charge when rates are low and use that charged energy when rates are high. Resiliency, we've talked about a bit with microgrids, protecting critical loads. And then these additional revenue opportunities are like demand response programs, capacity markets, and other grid services, which are kind of icing on the cake to the peak demand charge reductions. We can't forget about the carbon reduction aspect, where we're integrating intermittent renewables. If you have ways to do that, you can integrate more. You know, if you have storage, then generally you can integrate more renewables to take advantage of that excess production and keep it on site. All right, so cost savings and revenue streams by DER type. So if you think about battery storage, it's very flexible. You can dispatch it when you need to. So it's pretty flexible in reducing peak demand, shifting consumption. You know, utility demand response programs really like battery storage because it can be dispatched and it doesn't require kind of the building occupants to have approved that their temperature is going to go up 5 degrees, that kind of thing. And participating in wholesale markets, you know, the flexibility and the quickness of response time for battery storage is important in markets. Thermal storage has similar properties. It's not quite as fast acting. Building loads can be very fast acting. They may be a little bit more challenging to implement, but we'll talk about that in a second. And then CHP, as we talked about before, is more of a base load. All right, so commercial sector demand charges. Where in the country, this is trying to point to where in the country are there high demand charges where it may be really economical based on those demand charges to install storage or solar storage combination. So these high demand charges, like I said before, support battery cost effectiveness. You may want a rate structure with high demand charges, which sounds counterintuitive. But if you're able to manage that demand, those rate structures have lower energy charges, so you can come out ahead financially. And so more storage projects are economical at the 15 per kilowatt demand charge range. In this NREL report from 2017 shows which territories had that demand charges in that range across the country. So it's becoming more prevalent, higher demand charges. Okay, so thinking about your own demand profile is very important. We all talk about you know, how peaky your demand profile is, and it makes a difference in how much demand is reduced, let's say with the same size of storage. So in the first figure here, we're reducing peak demand from 250 to 200 kW for this pretty flat profile. So that same amount of storage in this example can reduce this example on the right from 325 kW to 225 kW because it's more peaky and you're not using that storage as consistently over that time frame. So you would get more demand cost savings from the right profile than the left profile. Now that doesn't mean you want a peaky profile if you can help it. You want to manage your loads to minimize those peaks, and that's preferable because you don't want to have to install batteries. It's more cost. But if you can't get around having those demand peaks, then battery storage can result in that significant demand savings and higher cost savings than if you had this flat profile. All right. Now we're going to walk through this example here to talk about solar storage and the synergies for peak demand reduction with solar storage. So in this first piece, if you just have solar, there's little impact on reducing the peak. You can see in the, this is a artificial load profile, really flat, but in the morning and in the evening, you're reducing a little bit. You're reducing the midday a lot, but overall your peak is still set in the morning or the evening. So you have a little bit of impact on the peak, but not that much. Storage alone, if you had the same size of battery and you used it to clip this entire peak demand, you would clip a certain amount with that size of battery and then charge it at night. With solar plus storage together, you see that that same size of battery is able to clip the demand a lot further because it's not having to reduce the demand in the middle of the day. It just can focus on this morning and evening time frames. So this study by LBNL and NREL really tried to quantify how much synergies are there between solar and storage, and what can owners expect from that. So this kind of summarizes that study. It was a simulation study, so they looked at different climates, different building types, different customer load and PV generation profiles, and did kind of this is a plot of the number of simulations. What is the reduction in billing demand? So you can see there's a wide range of reduction, with the median being about 42% for solar plus storage reduction in billing demand. For those same simulations, only 8% reduction in demand for solar and 23% for storage only. 8% for solar only. So this synergy is, they're more than the sum of their parts. And I described that, just applied those numbers to an example showing that a storage only might save about $1,800 a month in peak demand cost savings, and solar plus storage might save $3,800 a month. So we've been talking about demand. Now we're going to kind of sort of switch gears and talk about energy. So the time of use pricing for energy consumption, which a lot of commercial customers are on time of use pricing. You can reduce energy charges by shifting when your energy is consumed. This is an example from SMUD that shows how their pricing works for their some commercial customer rate schedules. You can see the vast difference in cost between off-peak and peak times, especially in the summer, up to 29 cents a kilowatt hour peak, which may be shocking to some people. And so it really obviously drives some decision making on when you're going to use that energy and how you can use storage to help you avoid peak using that energy during those peak hours between 5 and 8 p.m. for this particular utility. So this is another value stream. This is sort of the energy arbitrage value stream. All right, so you have demand reduction, peak demand reduction, you have energy arbitrage, and then you also have markets and programs that you can participate in for additional revenue opportunities. So that includes wholesale markets and other utility programs. The other thing we should mention here is that the net electricity export compensation, so you heard of net energy metering laws, that's the billing mechanism that allows customers who generate their own electricity on site to use it at another time. So those laws are really important in how you can get the value out of your solar, and whether you can sell it at retail rate, or if you have a wholesale rate, you have to sell it back to the grid at. It makes a big difference in the cost effectiveness. So the rules around how these DERs can operate, rules around net energy metering, rules around wholesale markets and how DERs, let's say, operate in capacity markets are really being worked out now nationally and through FERC, and then individually by each region. So it's an evolving thing to keep an eye on. Utility programs are also evolving. Demand response programs, emergency load relief programs, so generally using your building loads or your storage to reduce demand when called upon, have been around a long time. And so those are still continuing to happen across the country. Now we're also seeing some virtual power plant pilots. And what this is when a utility needs to meet power needs, like in SoCal Ed's case, when generation facilities are retired, they're trying to meet that with DERs and able to call upon DERs for capacity when needed under certain conditions of feeders and so forth. So it's a whole new ballgame, and another revenue stream that, at least in SCE's territory, is very lucrative for the folks that are part of that project. It helps fund their systems, their battery systems. So that's something also to keep an eye on. We have a number of example DER projects. We interviewed all these folks and others. I'm not going to go into the details of these, especially because we're going to have this follow-on webinar. But I guess some of the commonalities among this that we sort of saw in these interviews is that the main benefit was, again, this peak demand reduction value stream. They're using a portion of their battery for demand side management. And then they were also using a portion of the battery to be dispatched by the utility based on grid needs. So all these folks were part of SCE's local capacity reduction program. So they got those two value streams as a part of their battery installation. All right, so this market is changing a lot, and we're going to talk a bit about DER solution providers that keep tabs on all this kind of thing, so you don't have to. The rules to, how to participate in wholesale markets are changing, like I mentioned, the net energy metering policies and the different utility programs you can be a part of. I put this the duck curve example from the Northeast here on this slide, just to show that the duck curve isn't only in California and Hawaii, it's in the Northeast as well. So you can see that that pretty sharp decrease and increase over time based on the solar on the grid. All right, so we're going to go through a little bit on installation. This is a lot of stuff on this slide. This is more for reference. I just want to make a point that this project developer piece here really brings together all these parties. So if you're an owner and you look at, oh gosh, there's all these people I have to coordinate with throughout all these phases of a life cycle, you're really leaning heavy on the project developer to coordinate the pieces and parts. And be that interface to you as the owner. So in the interest of time, I'm going to leave this as a reference. Maybe we'll go through this more detailed in a future webinar. We also have contracting structures. In our interviews, we saw power purchase agreements, shared savings, and like lease arrangements. Energy as a service options was, the real key was to owners was no or low money down. They pay for it based on the savings each month, and they true up that savings based on what would have been their energy bill would have been without the DERs. So there's definitely financed models out there. Other considerations, permitting, of course, always an issue, site constraints. This picture shows the parking lot. This is a pretty common thing to be putting your PV as structures in your parking lot. It avoids having to go on the roof and deal with roof loads. So that's becoming more prevalent. And then determining if grid upgrades are required. This depends on really what your utility rules are and if the project is a certain size and so forth. So to put DERs on the grid, sometimes there needs to be actually grid upgrades to accommodate those DERs. And then each DER is different, of course. We have solar PV. It's a mature industry. The panels have a fairly long life. The typical rule of thumb is degradation of 1% per year, useful life of 20 to 25 years. Inverters may be another story, but you know, keeping track of making sure the inverters are working is important. And PV is not flexible. You know, when the sun shines, the sun shines. Battery storage is an emerging, developing maturity, 5 to 10 year warranties, and very flexible. Thermal storage, mature, long life, and flexible. So combined heat and power, we've talked about, this has been around a long time, and it's not very flexible because it does take some ramp up and ramp down time. So it's not generally used for short time periods. And then building loads, demand response is mature. Some of the more like detailed use of automated demand reduction may not be so mature. And it is flexible, although there is this ongoing training to make sure that the building load flexibility works for occupants, works for the building operating team. And then EV charging is an emerging area as well. All right, so we start to think about what does it mean to optimize DERs and building loads, and who's doing that right now? We have HVAC control vendors may have DER optimization EMIS capabilities. If you think about, they're already controlling the building HVAC and sometimes lighting systems. They're probably controlling thermal storage, maybe combined heat and power. And now for them, it's just adding battery storage, PV, and potentially EV charging to the mix and including that in their controls. Other folks are mainly focused on storage and PV, so their solar storage is their focus. So this EMIS layer to bring it all together is an emerging area. We're going to have a future presentation on kind of the potential for EMIS to bridge all this for visualization and analytics. So that'll be coming probably in the fall. And so there's challenges, of course, to co-optimizing DERs and building loads. We want to obviously minimize impact on occupants, so using your building loads isn't always possible to flex those loads in shed and shift, interoperability and complexity. But why would you want to coordinate your, let's say, your battery storage and your building loads? The main thing that comes out is reducing your battery size and investment. It's costly. If we can take some of that peak demand off with flexible building loads, then we don't have to get as big of a battery system. And you know, organizing this and coordinating this all in one place avoids the silos of different control systems. Okay, so best practices. I'm not going to pause on this too long. We're running out of time, so maybe we'll come back to this in a future webinar. We've talked about most of these things. I'll just say that commissioning building systems is really important. It's hard to be flexible with building loads that are not responsive to the controls you sent to them. So commissioning is key. All right, so now I'm getting to our characterization and the interviews with the DER solutions providers that we did. We started to see sort of two different solutions provider types, which I sort of alluded to earlier. We have solar storage. So they finance, own, operate, and maintain, usually sort of a turnkey kind of solar storage solution. We have multiple DER solution providers that are a bit broader generally, and they include maybe thermal storage and CHP, central HVAC plants, and then also now we're bringing in battery and PV. We've talked about microgrids. I won't dwell on that right now. All right, there's other players in the market. So here there's, you know, solar storage and multiple DERs. We're talking about these solutions providers that really kind of bring together a turnkey solution. Then we also have software-only providers that develop that DER optimization software, and they may sell that to the DER solutions provider, so the solution provider doesn't have to have their own piece of software and develop that software. We also have owners' representatives to help them through, developing RFPs and supporting the development of and oversight of installing these systems. And not to forget the equipment providers themselves, the battery manufacturers, the PV panel, thermal storage systems, EV charging stations. Finally, the demand response aggregators help aggregate those building loads and participate in markets to achieve that additional revenue stream through DR. Okay, so this gets to the actual vendors and how we classified them. I should say about this matrix is that to have a dot in a particular cell means that you're coordinating that resource with another resource. So you've integrated control of, let's say, solar and battery storage, for instance, with those first two columns after vendors. And so you'll see that in multiple DERs. Obviously, there's more than just solar and storage and battery storage. And I should also say that this is sort of not a comprehensive vendor list. We interviewed as many as we could, and that we could get, detailed interviews with. So don't consider this a recommendation or the lack of someone on here being not a recommendation. Visualization is a key part of owners being able to look at what's going on with DERs. We're going to have another meeting about visualization specifically, and we can go through how you're looking at what's happening in your system, how that you can see that the demand is being clipped, and what your solar load is, and what your EV charging load is, and so forth. So visualization can give you a look into what's going on. Also, diagnostics kind of bridges us into EMIS. Okay, so our takeaways here. Grid interactive efficient buildings provide benefits and unprecedented control over load shape. So we have all these revenue streams, multiple revenue streams to think about how it affects your buildings. We have owners currently implementing these technologies and growing maturity in the market. And grid interactive energy efficient buildings are really the future of the way we're going with buildings. But there's a lot of steps that need to get there. So I think as a part of this tech team, we're going to be talking a lot about how this all relates to operating your building, making sure you can do fault detection and understand what's going on with all your systems in this new area as well. So thank you for coming today. We're going to take your questions now through the chat. And I'll have Claire, who's been aggregating questions. Hi.
Yeah, hi, Hannah. Hi. So yeah, first question is on the roles of how much involvement do building engineers and operators have in managing the DERs?
Okay, so it depends on whether they have a system that the DER solutions provider operates and maintains, or that they're more responsible for. But in most cases, there's some kind of interface, like I mentioned before, with the facility managers and building engineers to view how the DERs are being dispatched. When you have building or battery storage, a lot of times it's just kind of behind the scenes. It's a set it and forget it kind of thing. So you're not really actively doing things day to day with that. You have to make sure that those control settings are working properly to minimize your peak demand and get it as low as you can. But it's not something that is adding a lot to your daily workload.
Okay, great. Next one is for EMIS, or Energy Management Information Systems. How are those products approaching DERs and DER integration?
Yeah, so we didn't do a comprehensive look. I'll go back to this graphic of kind of the overlay of EMIS. So some EMIS, a few that we looked at, I would say like the Schneider and the Siemens are, and to some extent Johnson Controls, are really trying to optimize across all these DERs and have a control routine that does that. And in terms of the fault detection and visualization and analytics, beyond the loads and HVAC fault detection, there's things you have to manage around battery storage and making sure you're adhering to the warranties for the batteries. So that can be tracked through your EMIS. Definitely visualization, like we saw here. I could go through, I guess I have a little bit of time to go through now, the graph here. So what this is showing is if we start off with the actual gross energy usage, which is this top dotted line here. So that dotted blue line is, what you would have used without solar or storage. This yellow area here is the solar, so that's your generation. And so with taking off the solar, now you have this orange load. You want to clip that peak here. You want to clip all this orange peak. So what you do is you use your battery storage, and then in this case, it's clipped to not exceed about a 40 kW threshold. And you can see here, it never exceeds that. And when this green goes underneath the x-axis, that's showing how the solar is being used to charge the storage back up so that it can continue to clip the peak the next day. So this is an example of the visualization that is fairly common within the EMIS that do incorporate these types of DERs.
Great, okay. Next question, if you want to slide back to slide 19, which is the red slide about value streams.
Okay.
So we can all look at that same time.
There we go.
So there you go. So the question is, the value streams generated from DERs are ranked higher to lower, so 1 through 4, but the question is, doesn't their relative value vary significantly by geography? So like demand charges are high and very high in California, but not so much in other places.
Yeah, yeah. It's a very good point. This is, this ranking is not really a ranking, it was just a list. So it totally depends on your location, whether you have high peak demand charges, whether you have these programs to participate in demand response programs might be very lucrative. So you may decide that the demand response program is really driving your investment, and you want to make sure that you have capacity to respond to those grid dispatch signals. I put it in this order only because we heard a lot from owners about the savings mostly coming from peak demand charges. However, we were talking more with West Coast owners. So, this could definitely be different in different parts of the country that don't have as high of peak demand charges.
Okay, great, thanks. And last question I think we have here is from Craig Wright from Aurora School District in Colorado. You asked, have you seen emergence for the need of full-service third-party maintenance and operation providers in markets like K through 12 that haven't traditionally had them?
I don't know specifically about K through 12, but this whole turnkey, full-service, own, operate, maintain model, I'm just going to this, is becoming a lot more prevalent, and owners obviously really like it. They don't have to put up the capital. It's kind of out of their purview to have to keep it up and running. They just make sure that the savings are there, and it could be a shared savings kind of agreement. So that's just really the direction it's going. We didn't actually interview anyone that wasn't going that direction, although obviously if you're an owner, you can, if you have the system installed for a while, you can even buy out the system. But we had talked with folks that hadn't had it installed for as long as it would take to buy it out. So it's definitely the own, operate, maintain model is very important to help move this along.
Okay, great. That's all the questions we have. We should probably wrap up.
Okay, let me get to the end slide here, which I just flipped off of. I wanted to make sure you had our contact information, and feel free to ask additional questions. Like I said at the beginning, we really want to get folks involved in helping set the agenda for these tech team meetings. This one was real, the basics of DERs and how it relates to building loads. Other ones are going to be on all sorts of different topics, so we want to meet your needs on various topics. We'll have one about the results of the campaign and all the latest on the costs and savings metrics coming out of that research. So there'll be ones that we have planned, but then we have ones that are definitely need to just be driven by the group. So please contact us to let us know what you think. So Claire, do you have any closing comments on the signups or anything within Tech Team around who can sign up and that kind of?
Yeah, just wanted to put out the word that if anybody is either currently in the Smart Energy Analytics campaign and needs to know anything more about the EMIS Tech Team, reach out to me. And for anybody who is not in the campaign and is a building owner and would like to be part of Better Buildings in Better Buildings Alliance and the tech teams that are offered through it, again, give me a shout and I can point you in the right direction. So thanks everybody, and thank you for the presentation today, Hannah. It's really nicely done.
Thanks. Well, everyone have a great afternoon, and we'll see you next time. Take care.